By the 1980s, the once great British Leyland empire was in tatters. The industrial action the company had suffered in the 70s had left their reputation tarnished in the eyes of the public, and the quality of the cars they were actually producing was not brilliant. The company was at big risk of going under. They needed a lifeline, and they got one in the form of Honda. British Leyland formed a partnership with the Japanese company to create some cars in collaboration with them, save costs, and ultimately learn from Honda's reputation for reliability and quality and build theirs back up to be the same. In 1981, we got the first fruit of that partnership, the Triumph Acclaim. The Acclaim actually was just a bit of a stopgap car to kind of bridge the gap between old Leyland and new Leyland once the Honda partnership was properly underway. So you might imagine then that since it was just a stopgap car to plug the gap and enter a new era, that it was a bit average. Actually, despite what some of the Triumph purists might tell you, the Acclaim was a cracking little car. And you can ignore the myths about it being just a rebadged Honda as well. In order to make this car as appealing as possible to the British public, Leyland made a few key changes to the Ballade to turn it into the Acclaim to maximise sales. For a start, all Acclaims got a twin carb version of Honda's 1.3 litre engine. And let me tell you, it is fantastic. It's zingy, it's revvy, picks up really low in the rev range, and because you've got a 5-speed gearbox, quite rare for a Leyland car even in base spec, you can make the most of it. And the gearbox, in a typical 80s Japanese fashion, is snicky and tight and really nice to use. A lot of Japanese cars of this era were criticised for their ride quality, but the thing is, Japan could give their cars firm suspension because the roads over there are flawless, billiard table smooth, and I'm not sure there even is a Japanese word for pothole. In Britain, we don't quite have that luxury, so in order to make the Acclaim more capable on bumpy British roads, Triumph tweaked the suspension. It's all-round independent, but it's just a little bit softer than the Ballade, and that means rather than bouncing around all over the place, it's really compliant and really nice. And you've got a nice interior to enjoy that ride quality from. Whereas most Japanese interiors of this era are grey and plasticky and a bit dull, to be honest, the Triumph interior was tweaked to make it a bit more appealing to British Leyland's customers. You got nice lashings of chrome everywhere, you got more bright colours, more options for seat trims. This is a genuinely nice place to be compared to the equivalent Honda offering, which was grey. But that's nothing new. BL already knew how to make an interior that felt nice, but this is one that lasted. This is a 38-year-old car, and yet every single thing in it still works perfectly. All the switches and buttons click and clonk exactly as they should, and every function that happens corresponds to the button you pressed, on purpose. The Acclaim was a revolution for BL. Here was a car that was nice to be in and nice to drive, but it started in the morning. It stayed together, everything worked. This was a car you could buy with confidence. It was actually something you could rely on. So what if you fancy getting into one of these? Well, to find out what it's like to own one, let's have a chat with Simon, editor of Classics Monthly magazine, who owns this very Acclaim.
I don't know why I like it so much. It's fairly plain, it's a real old man's car, and this is champagne beige, so it can't even get more old than that, and the brown velour inside. Nothing about it should really shout desire, but I just love driving them. I think they look quite interesting now as well. I mean, they were criticised in the day, overly Japanese, but you know, that makes them different from other cars that you could have got at the time. Some things you can get fairly easily, but not many. It always seems to take quite a bit of searching because there's so few survivors, and although it did sell well, it wasn't like a million seller over here or anything like that. It doesn't go wrong very often, or it hasn't done, so you don't need parts that often, but if something does go wrong, you can't expect to have it on the road tomorrow. So if you are trying to use it on that basis, you need a second car as backup. Most people are really complimentary, they like it. It's surprising how many people I get come to the house, you know, delivering parcels or whatever, who used to have one in the day. I didn't think you'd get so many of that. You get it with Morris Minors and Minis and things like that, but an awful lot of people did have memories of having these, and they all seem to be pretty positive. They are brilliant little cars, they really are good.
And the British public loved it. It was the 7th best-selling car in the country by 1982 and remained the 8th best-selling in 1983. it cemented Honda's partnership with BL that went on to spawn the SD3 generation Rover 200 that replaced this car, and the two companies collaborated properly on the fantastic R8 generation Rover 200 that replaced that. And what was Triumph's reward for reinvigorating the brand, for cementing the partnership with Honda, and for rejuvenating interest in British Leyland? They got killed off. The Acclaim was the last car to bear the Triumph name because a restructuring of British Leyland's companies in 1984 saw Triumph phased out. The car that replaced this was the Rover SD3 200 and of course the Austin Montego. There was no place in BL's lineup for Triumph anymore, and as a result, this is the last ever Triumph. So it was the beginning of one era, but the end of another. Some purists of the marque look down on the Acclaim because it's not a sports car, it's nothing lustworthy or exotic, and it's not even actually that good to look at. But because of what it represented, because of what it did, and because of what it meant for the future of British car production, on the whole, I think the Acclaim can only be considered a triumph.